When the officers fell, he stood up. That's the moment that defined everything about February 26, 1945. At a tiny hamlet called Mooshof in Germany, Sergeant Aubrey Cosens watched his platoon commander die in the darkness, cut down by German machine gun fire. He looked around at what remained of his platoon, 4 men out of 30, huddled in shell holes under relentless fire. The attack had failed twice already. German paratroopers had counterattacked, and the situation was hopeless. Every rational calculation said to pull back, to consolidate, to wait for reinforcements. But Aubrey Cosens did not make rational calculations. He stood up in the middle of a fire-swept battlefield and took command. This is the story of sudden leadership under impossible circumstances. The story of one night when everything went wrong, and one man refused to accept defeat. The story of a railway worker from northern Ontario, who became a warrior when his brothers needed him. The story of why the Battle of Mooshof became known as the Queen's Own Rifle's toughest scrap in Germany. February 26, 1945, 0430 hours, outside the hamlet of Mooshof, Germany. The 1st Battalion, Queen's Own Rifles of Canada, prepared to attack across open ground in the darkness. This was part of Operation Blockbuster, the final push to clear German forces from the Rhineland. The objective was to capture the high ground south of Kalkar and Udem, then drive through the Hochwald forest to reach the Rhine River. If the Allies could cross the Rhine, they could drive into the heart of Germany and end the war. But first they had to break through the German defenses in the Rhineland, and those defenses were formidable. The Germans were fighting on their own soil for the first time, and Adolf Hitler had personally ordered them not to surrender an inch. The defenders were German paratroopers, elite soldiers who had been given orders to fight to the death. They had fortified the Rhineland with multiple defensive lines, including remnants of the Siegfried Line. They had dug trenches, built machine gun nests, and prepared interlocking fields of fire. Every farm building had been converted into a strongpoint. Every hamlet was a fortress. D Company of the Queen's Own Rifles was assigned to capture Mooshof, a cluster of 3 farm buildings on rising ground. The hamlet looked insignificant on the map, just a few structures in empty farmland near Udem. But Mooshof controlled the approach to the regiment's objectives, and it had to be taken. D Company was commanded by Major Ben Dunkelman, a tough and experienced officer from Toronto. 16 Platoon, part of D Company, was led by a platoon commander who would be killed before dawn. The platoon sergeant was Aubrey Cosens, a 23-year-old from Latchford, Ontario. 16 Platoon numbered about 30 men that night. Infantry soldiers armed with rifles and Bren guns. They had 2 Sherman tanks from the 1st Hussars in support, armor to help suppress the German defenses. The plan was straightforward: cross the start line at 0430, advance across open ground, and capture Mooshof before dawn. But nothing about combat is ever straightforward. Before 16 Platoon even reached the start line, German artillery opened fire. Heavy shells crashed down around the advancing Canadians, explosions tearing through the darkness. Shrapnel screamed through the air. Men went down, wounded or dead. But the platoon kept moving forward. They crossed the start line on time and pressed toward Mooshof through intense artillery and mortar fire. The ground was sodden from recent rains, thick mud that sucked at boots and made every step exhausting. German machine guns opened up as they approached the hamlet, tracer rounds cutting through the night. The Germans had fortified all 3 farm buildings, turning them into mutually supporting strongpoints. Machine gun nests covered the approaches from multiple angles, creating overlapping fields of fire. 16 Platoon attacked the 1st building, the platoon commander leading from the front. The 2 Sherman tanks laid down covering fire, 75mm guns pounding the German positions. Canadian infantry rushed forward through the fire, trying to close with the enemy. But the German defense was too strong. Machine guns cut down the leading men, and the attack stalled. The platoon commander ordered a withdrawal to regroup, pulling back under heavy fire. Men were already wounded, already dead, but they had to try again. The platoon reorganized and attacked a second time, pushing forward with desperate courage. Again the German machine guns opened fire, again men fell, and again the attack was beaten back. The Canadian infantry took cover in shell holes and ditches, pinned down by murderous fire. And then the Germans counterattacked. German paratroopers came out of Mooshof in force, attacking through the darkness. They knew the ground intimately, every fold and depression, every approach route. They used that knowledge to infiltrate the positions 16 Platoon had hastily occupied. What followed was brutal close-quarters combat in complete darkness. Canadians and Germans fired at muzzle flashes, threw grenades blindly, fought hand-to-hand. The noise was overwhelming, rifle fire, explosions, men screaming in pain and rage. 16 Platoon fought with savage desperation, knowing that if they broke, they would die. Sergeant Aubrey Cosens was everywhere during the counterattack, directing fire, encouraging men, fighting alongside them. Eventually, the German counterattack was beaten off, the paratroopers falling back to their strong points. But the cost had been terrible. The platoon commander was dead, killed in the confused fighting. More than half the platoon had been killed or wounded, bodies lying in the mud. One of the 2 Sherman tanks had been knocked out by German fire, burning in the darkness. Aubrey Cosens looked around and counted the survivors. 4 men, that's all that remained of 16 Platoon. 4 riflemen, and 1 tank against a fortified position held by at least 50 German paratroopers. The situation was hopeless. Any reasonable assessment would conclude the attack had failed. But Aubrey Cosens was not interested in reasonable assessments. He was a sergeant, the senior NCO, and with the officer dead, command fell to him. He could have pulled back, consolidated with the rest of D Company, reported that Mooshof was too strong to take. No one would have questioned that decision. Not after what 16 Platoon had already endured. But Aubrey Cosens made a different choice. He stood up and told his 4 men that they were going to capture Mooshof. Aubrey Charles Cosens had been born in Latchford, Ontario, on May 21, 1921. His father was Charles Edward Cosens, a First World War veteran who worked on the railway. His mother was Yvonne Cosens, and Aubrey was their only son. Shortly after Aubrey's birth, the family moved to near Porquist Junction, a remote community in northern Ontario. The Cosens family lived in a converted train wagon, typical housing for railway workers in the north. When Aubrey was just 4 years old in 1925, his mother died of cancer. Charles was left alone with a young son, working long hours on the railway. Neighbors had helped during Yvonne's illness, and they continued to care for Aubrey after her death. Eventually, Mrs. Dorothy Smith, whose husband worked on the railway with Charles, took over Aubrey's upbringing completely. Aubrey grew up in that harsh northern landscape, learning toughness and self-reliance early. He attended the local school at Porquist Junction, but left at 17 to find work during the Depression. Aubrey got a job as a section hand on the Temiskaming and Northern Ontario Railway, the same work his father did. It was hard physical labor, maintaining railroad tracks in all weather, but it paid. Aubrey worked the railway for about a year, saving money and building muscle. Then in September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and the Second World War began. Aubrey was 18 years old when war broke out, and he immediately tried to enlist. He wanted to join the Royal Canadian Air Force, dreaming of becoming a pilot or aircrew. But the RCF rejected him, reportedly because he had forgotten to bring his school reports with him. Aubrey waited impatiently through 1939 and into 1940, watching as other men joined up and shipped overseas. Finally, on November 12, 1940, Aubrey took the train to Hamilton, Ontario. He enlisted in the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders of Canada at the age of 19. He joined as a private, the lowest rank, starting his military career from the bottom. The recruiting records described Aubrey as 5 feet 9 inches tall, weighing 162 pounds, with blue eyes and brown hair. The Argylls were a Highland regiment with a proud history, and Aubrey wore the kilt during training. He served with the Argylls in Canada, then was sent to Jamaica for garrison duty. In July 1941, the regiment sailed for England, joining the Canadian forces gathering there. But after serving with the Argylls for several years, Aubrey transferred to a different regiment. He joined the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada in the summer of 1944, transferring as a corporal. The Queen's Own Rifles were one of the oldest infantry regiments in the Canadian Army, founded in 1860. Aubrey quickly proved his worth to his new regiment, and he was promoted to sergeant. On June 6, 1944, D-Day arrived, and the Queen's Own Rifles landed on Juno Beach in Normandy. Aubrey was not in the first wave. He arrived as a reinforcement in July. He landed in Normandy and immediately entered the brutal fighting for the beachhead. From June through August 1944, Aubrey fought across Normandy with the Queen's Own Rifles. The regiment helped close the Falaise Gap in northern France, trapping thousands of German soldiers. Then they advanced across France and Belgium, liberating towns and cities. The Queen's Own Rifles fought in the siege of Boulogne, capturing that key port city. Then came the Scheldt campaign in autumn 1944, fighting in flooded polders in Holland. The men called themselves water rats because they spent weeks fighting in knee-deep water and mud. Aubrey Cosens had been in combat almost continuously since joining the Queen's Own Rifles. 8 months of constant fighting. He had seen friends killed, had led men through hell, had learned what it meant to be a soldier. One of his comrades later recalled an incident that showed Aubrey's character perfectly. Before one attack, a young soldier was struggling to fasten his equipment belt because his hands were shaking with fear. German shells were falling all around, and the soldier could not get the buckle done. Aubrey Cosens came by and saw the difficulty, and without a word he knelt down in the mud. He fastened the young soldier's belt while death-dealing metal flew overhead. The image of a sergeant kneeling in the mud before a frightened rifleman, helping him get ready for battle, said everything about Aubrey's leadership. By February 1945, the green recruit who had joined in 1940 was gone. In his place was a hardened combat veteran who knew exactly what war demanded. And what war demanded that night at Mooshoff was leadership when the officers fell. Aubrey Cosens positioned his 4 surviving riflemen to provide covering fire. He found good positions where they could see the German strongpoints and suppress enemy fire. He told them exactly what he was going to do, and he told them to keep firing no matter what happened. Then Aubrey Cosens did something that looked like suicide. He stood up in full view of the enemy and ran across open ground toward the one remaining Sherman tank. The ground was completely flat, offering no cover, swept by machine gun fire from multiple positions. German mortars were falling constantly, shells exploding all around the battlefield. Aubrey sprinted across that kill zone, bullets cracking past him, mortar fragments screaming through the air. He reached the tank somehow, untouched, and climbed up onto the hull. The tank commander was a young officer from the 1st Hussars, shocked to see an infantry sergeant appear on his tank. Aubrey told the tank commander that he was going to direct the tank's fire onto the German positions. And then Aubrey Cosens did something even more audacious. He climbed up onto the front of the tank turret and sat down in full view of the enemy. He positioned himself on the most exposed part of the tank, sitting in front of the turret where everyone could see him. From that position, he could see the German strongpoints clearly and direct the tank's fire. The tank commander later testified about what happened next. He said that Aubrey Cosens calmly pointed out enemy positions while sitting completely exposed on the tank. He said Aubrey was harassed by snipers the entire time, bullets hitting the tank around him. He said Aubrey showed magnificent contempt for the very great danger. Those were the exact words used later in official reports. Magnificent contempt for danger. Aubrey directed the Sherman 75mm gun onto the German machine gun nests. High explosive shells slammed into the farm buildings, suppressing the defensive fire. The tank's machine guns raked the German positions, forcing the defenders to take cover. And then the Germans counterattacked again, determined to drive the Canadians back. German paratroopers charged out of Mooshoff in strength, firing as they advanced. They came in overwhelming numbers, expecting to crush the handful of Canadians. Aubrey Cosens remained sitting on the tank turret, completely exposed, directing fire into the attacking Germans. The Sherman's guns fired point-blank into the German assault, cutting down attackers. Aubrey's 4 riflemen poured fire from their positions, adding to the defensive barrage. The German attack faltered as men fell, broke apart under the concentrated fire, and fell back. Aubrey had held his ground on top of the tank, refusing to take cover, leading the defense by example. With the counterattack beaten off, Aubrey made his next move. He told the tank commander to drive the Sherman forward and ram the first farm building. The tank commander thought Aubrey was insane. You don't ram buildings with a Sherman tank. But Aubrey insisted, and he was still sitting on the front of the turret giving orders. The Sherman lurched forward through the darkness, accelerating toward the first barn. Aubrey rode on the front of the tank like some kind of medieval knight charging into battle. The 44-ton Sherman crashed into the wall of the barn with tremendous force. The wooden structure buckled under the impact, walls collapsing, the building partially demolished. German soldiers inside were thrown around by the impact, stunned and disoriented, and Aubrey Cosens jumped off the tank and went into the building alone. He entered the first barn by himself, moving through the wreckage with his rifle. German paratroopers were inside, trying to recover from the shock of the tank ramming the building. Aubrey killed several of them in close combat, firing his rifle at point-blank range. Others threw down their weapons and surrendered, hands raised, terrified of this lone Canadian. Aubrey took the prisoners and sent them back to his 4 riflemen, then turned to the second building. He went into the second farm structure alone, again moving through hostile territory without support. More Germans were inside, more were killed or captured, and Aubrey cleared that building too. Then he moved to the third building, the last German strongpoint in Moosehof. This was a 2-story structure, larger than the others, held by several German soldiers. Aubrey crossed the road alone and entered the building, rifle ready. He fought his way through the structure, clearing rooms, killing defenders who resisted. Intense machine gun and small arms fire poured at him from the Germans still fighting. One of his comrades later reported that they followed Aubrey from building to building, gathering the prisoners he sent out. By the time Aubrey finished clearing the third building, Moosehof was in Canadian hands. The hard core of German resistance had been broken by one man's audacity and courage. Aubrey Cosens had personally killed at least 20 German soldiers that night. He had taken at least 20 more as prisoners. He had captured 3 fortified buildings that an entire platoon could not take. He had done it with 4 riflemen and 1 tank, against odds that should have been impossible. Aubrey gathered his men and began consolidating the position. He gave orders for organizing the defense of Moosehof, preparing for German counterattacks. He positioned his riflemen, checked ammunition supplies, and made sure the wounded were being treated. Then he set off to find his company commander to report that the objective was captured. Aubrey walked back across the battlefield in the pre-dawn darkness. The fighting had died down. German fire was sporadic. Dawn was approaching. Aubrey had survived the desperate attack, survived sitting exposed on a tank, survived clearing 3 buildings alone. He was walking back to report mission accomplished. And then a single rifle shot cracked through the darkness. A German sniper had been watching the battlefield, waiting for a target. He fired once, one carefully aimed shot at the Canadian sergeant walking across open ground. The bullet struck Aubrey Cosens in the head. He fell instantly, killed almost immediately, never knowing what hit him. Sergeant Aubrey Cosens was 23 years old. He had survived the entire battle only to die moments after victory. His comrades found him lying on the battlefield, still carrying his rifle. The man who had shown magnificent contempt for danger had finally run out of luck. The Battle of Moosehof continued after Aubrey's death. The Queen's Own Rifles held the position and continued advancing toward their final objectives. But the cost had been terrible. February 26th became known as the regiment's toughest scrap in Germany. 4 officers were killed and 3 wounded that day. 28 enlisted men were killed, and 5 more would die of their wounds. 60 other men were wounded, making it the 3rd deadliest action the Queen's Own Rifles experienced during the entire war. Among the dead was Private Charles Nowogajich, a young indigenous rifleman who was posthumously awarded the Military Medal. Among the many acts of bravery that day, Aubrey Cosens' leadership stood out. Major Ben Dunkelman, the D Company commander, wrote a detailed report of what Aubrey had accomplished. He recommended Aubrey for the Victoria Cross, the highest award for valor in the Commonwealth. The recommendation went up the chain of command, through battalion, brigade, division, and corps. Every officer who read it agreed that this was Victoria Cross territory. On May 17, 1945, the war in Europe ended with Germany's surrender. The Queen's Own Rifles had fought all the way to the Baltic Sea, completing their mission, but they had paid a terrible price, leaving too many friends in graves across Europe. Aubrey Cosens was buried at the Canadian War Cemetery at Groesbeek in the Netherlands. Groesbeek Cemetery holds over 2,500 Canadian war dead, soldiers who died liberating Holland and Germany. Aubrey's grave is marked with a white Portland stone headstone like all Commonwealth war graves. The inscription reads, Sergeant A.C. Cosens V.C., the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada, 26th February 1945, age 23. At the top of the headstone is engraved the Victoria Cross emblem, indicating the highest award for valor. Below the official inscription is a personal epitaph chosen by his family. It reads simply, Enduring Love and Loyalty. On September 14, 1945, the Victoria Cross was announced for Sergeant Aubrey Charles Cosens. The citation was published in the London Gazette, the official record of honors and awards. It described in formal military language the extraordinary courage Aubrey had displayed. The citation stated that in the Rhineland on February 26, 1945, Sergeant Cosens's platoon had attacked enemy strongpoints. It described how they were twice beaten back by Germans who had strongly entrenched themselves in several farm buildings. It noted that on the third attack, the enemy counterattacked and Sergeant Cosens' platoon commander and several men were killed. The citation then described Aubrey's actions in precise detail. It stated that Aubrey at once assumed command of the only 4 survivors of his platoon. It noted that under heavy fire, Aubrey rushed across open ground to reach the one remaining tank. The citation described how Aubrey sat on the front of the turret, in full view of the enemy, directing the fire of the tank. It stated that he was harassed by continuous small arms and sniper fire and surrounded by enemy soldiers. The citation noted that a further enemy counterattack was repulsed at a range of 30 yards. It described how Aubrey then ordered the tank to attack the farm buildings and dismounted to enter them alone. The citation stated that despite heavy machine gun and small arms fire, Aubrey personally killed at least 20 enemy troops. It noted that he took an equal number of prisoners and cleared all 3 farm buildings. The final paragraph described what this act of heroism meant. It stated that Sergeant Cosens' superb leadership and the dash and gallant conduct with which he carried out this attack enabled his company to capture a position which was vital to the success of the future operations of the brigade. The Victoria Cross was Canada's highest military honor, and Aubrey was the 10th member of the Queen's Own Rifles to receive it. He was one of 94 Canadians to receive the Victoria Cross, and one of 16 awarded during World War II. The medal itself could not be presented to Aubrey, so it was given to his father, Charles Cosens. The ceremony took place in Canada, where Charles received the Bronze Cross on behalf of his son. He was told that Aubrey had died a hero, that his courage would be remembered forever. But the Victoria Cross could not fill the hole left by his only son's death. In the years after the war, Canada honored Aubrey Cosens' memory in multiple ways. In 1952, the Canadian Army named a new armory in Porquet Junction after him. The Sergeant Aubrey Cosens V.C. Armory served as the home of the Algonquin Regiment. The building stood as a memorial to the local boy who had become a national hero. In Latchford, Ontario, his birthplace, the community erected memorials to honor his memory. A monument in the town describes his actions at Moosehoff and his posthumous Victoria Cross. Schools in northern Ontario teach Aubrey's story as an example of courage and leadership. Students learn about the railway worker who became a war hero, the sergeant who stood up when the officers fell. The Queen's Own Rifles of Canada maintain extensive records and displays about Aubrey Cosens. Every year, the regiment commemorates February 26th as a day of remembrance. They gather to honor Aubrey and the other men who fought and died at Moosehoff. Veterans of the regiment tell younger soldiers about that desperate February night in Germany. They describe how one sergeant and 4 men captured a position that should have required a company. They ensure that Aubrey's example of leadership and courage is never forgotten. The story of Aubrey Cosens matters for several profound reasons. First, it demonstrates that leadership is not about rank. It is about character and action. Aubrey was a sergeant, not an officer, when his platoon commander was killed. He could have waited for an officer to arrive and take command. He could have pulled back and reported that the attack had failed. But instead, he stood up and took command because someone had to. Leadership emerged in the moment when it was needed most. not from a commission or a promotion. Second, the story shows the power of personal example in inspiring others. Aubrey did not order his 4 men to do anything he would not do himself. He ran across open ground first. He climbed onto the tank first. He entered the buildings first. His men followed him because they saw him leading from the front. That kind of leadership by example is extraordinarily powerful in combat. Third, Aubrey's story demonstrates the importance of initiative and improvisation. There was no plan for ramming buildings with a Sherman tank. That was pure improvisation. There was no doctrine for sitting on top of a tank turret directing fire. That was pure audacity. Aubrey saw what needed to be done and did it, regardless of whether it was in the manual. Military organizations value following orders, but sometimes the greatest victories come from those who dare to improvise. Fourth, the story illustrates the cost of victory. Aubrey captured Moosehoff and enabled the brigade's advance, achieving the mission. But he paid for that victory with his life, killed by a sniper just moments after success. War is not about glory or adventure, it is about sacrifice and loss. Aubrey's death reminds us that even victorious battles exact a terrible price. Fifth, Aubrey's story shows how ordinary people can do extraordinary things. Aubrey Cosens was not a professional soldier. He was a railway worker from Northern Ontario. He had no special advantages, no elite training, no powerful connections. What he had was courage, determination, and a refusal to accept defeat. When the moment demanded leadership, he provided it. That means any of us might find that same strength, if we are ever faced with such a choice. The tactical lessons from Moosehoff are still taught in military schools today. The battle is studied at the Royal Military College of Canada and other military academies. Officers analyze Aubrey's decisions, his leadership techniques, his tactical choices. They examine how he took command after his officer was killed. They study how he coordinated infantry and armor in a desperate situation. They learn how personal courage can inspire men to achieve the seemingly impossible. Modern infantry officers face similar challenges in combat zones around the world. Small units isolated in hostile territory, taking heavy casualties, forced to accomplish difficult missions. The principles Aubrey demonstrated at Moosehoff remain as relevant today as in 1945. Lead from the front, share the danger, inspire through personal example. Take command when command is needed, improvise when plans fail, never give up. That February night at Moosehoff, everything went wrong for 16 Platoon. They attacked twice and were beaten back both times. The Germans counterattacked and killed their platoon commander. More than half the platoon was dead or wounded. One of their 2 supporting tanks was knocked out. 4 men remained out of 30, 4 riflemen against 50 German paratroopers. Every rational calculation said the attack had failed. But when the officers fell, Aubrey Cosens stood up. He did not wait for orders. He did not call for reinforcements. He did not retreat. He stood up in the middle of a fire-swept battlefield and took command. He ran across open ground under machine gun fire to reach a Sherman tank. He climbed onto the front of the turret and sat there in full view of the enemy. He directed the tank's fire while snipers shot at him, showing magnificent contempt for danger. He rode the tank as it rammed the first building, then jumped off and cleared it alone. He cleared the second building alone, killing Germans and taking prisoners. He cleared the third building alone, breaking the last German resistance. He personally killed at least 20 enemy soldiers and took 20 more as prisoners. He captured 3 fortified buildings with 4 men and 1 tank. He accomplished what an entire platoon could not, through sheer audacity and courage. And then, moments after victory, a sniper's bullet found him. Aubrey Cosens died on the battlefield at age 23. He died having shown what leadership truly means. He died having inspired his men to achieve the impossible. He died having fulfilled his duty to the very last moment. The Victoria Cross citation called it superb leadership and gallant conduct. But those formal words cannot capture what really happened that night. What happened was that a railway worker from Northern Ontario became a warrior when his brothers needed him. What happened was that a sergeant took command when his officer fell. What happened was that one man refused to accept defeat, even when defeat seemed certain. Aubrey Cosens is buried in the Netherlands, far from the railway towns of Northern Ontario where he grew up. His headstone bears the Victoria Cross emblem and the words enduring love and loyalty. Those words describe not just his family's feelings, but Aubrey's own character. He showed enduring loyalty to his men, refusing to leave them even when the situation was hopeless. He showed enduring love for his country, giving his life to complete the mission. The legacy of Sergeant Aubrey Cosens lives on in Canada today. His name is on memorials. His story is taught in schools. His example inspires new generations of soldiers. But more than that, his story reminds us of a fundamental truth about courage. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is action taken despite fear. Leadership is not about rank or title. It is about character and example. Heroism is not about seeking glory. It is about doing what needs to be done. When the officers fell at Moosehoff, Aubrey Cosens stood up, not because he was ordered to, not because it was expected, but because someone had to. He stood up and led 4 men against impossible odds. He stood up and showed what one determined person can accomplish. He stood up and proved that leadership emerges when it is needed most. That is the essence of Aubrey Cosens' legacy, not the medals or the memorials, but the example of sudden leadership under fire. The example of a man who stood up when others fell. The example of courage, initiative, and selfless service. Sergeant Aubrey Charles Cosens' Victoria Cross. A railway worker who became a warrior. A sergeant who became a legend. A 23-year-old from Northern Ontario who showed the world what leadership truly means. When the officers fell, he stood up. And that made all the difference.